Hello and welcome to the Untitled Anarchist Seagull channel. I'm your host, an Untitled Anarchist Seagull called Elise, and today I didn't get seasick playing En Garde, so that's an improvement. Got a number of possible options here that I was just checking out. We've got some more Caleb Muppet. We've got some David Pac-Man, because I do like to look at some liberal swill every once in a while, and there's no swillier liberal on YouTube than David Pac-Man. We've got somebody asking David Pac-Man what he would do in Israel and Gaza, which that should suck. We've also got our old ghouls over at PragerU, a moral case for capitalism, and I'm sure that is going to reward our viewing. There's also Bush with the next Benedict conspiracy, which, not sure exactly where he's going to go on that, but I have a feeling it might suck. Also, let's see what we've got. Xander Hole says the Taliban is taking over YouTube, which does not appear to be the case, actually. But, you know. I think maybe we start out. Then we've got libs of TikTok blamed for teen death by dishonest media. Because all Chaya Reichik did was incite violence. So how is it her fault that people did the violence she incited? Like, why? I mean, it's interesting how these people who love to talk about personal responsibility get when they are expected to be when they are personally responsible for things. That's another PragerU one. I think let's start out with a moral case for capitalism. I'm sure that's going to be classic.
Okay, we're told, so maybe capitalism is efficient. Maybe it generates...
Hang on, let me just get the, Wait, they put this crap in 4K? Like, nobody needs a PragerU video in 4K. Ah, bonsoir, slancha.
Okay, we're told, so maybe capitalism is efficient.
I love how they're making the strongest case against capitalism to start out.
Maybe it generates more wealth than other systems, but what about values?
Like, I mean, okay, so the idea is they're arguing against... Who are they arguing against? They're arguing against people who are already saying capitalism is great. But what about values? Like, who is making that argument? Capitalism is great, but what about values?
Things that can't be measured in cash. Things like kindness and loyalty and integrity.
Fuck those things.
Well, let me say something.
Oh god, author of Inventing Freedom, How the English-Speaking Peoples Made the Modern World. Yeah, because if there's anyone who brought, freedom to the modern world, it's the motherfuckers who invented chattel slavery.
Something that you won't hear very often. Let me make the moral case for capitalism.
I'm still... Can you make a moral case for that horrible fucking suit you're wearing first? Like, what is this suit? Where did he get this?
Let's go back nearly 12,000 years, to the moment when one of our ancestors made a world-changing discovery. It turned out that if you left seeds in fertile soil, plants would grow from them. Instead of having to forage, you could produce your own grains or fruits where you wanted.
Okay. So we're still like 12,000 years away from the development of capitalism there. So why are we starting here?
It didn't take long for someone to make the next discovery. Rather than spending all year tending to your own crops, you could wait for your neighbor to bring in his harvest and then steal it.
Except, I mean, that's not really how agriculture works. The crops aren't growing necessarily all year. They are growing part of the year. It's called the growing season.
And then came the truly diabolical discovery. If you wanted to maximize the ratio of effort to outcome, you could organize a gang of thugs and seize not only your neighbor's harvest, but everyone's harvest.
Oh, I get it. He's saying that these are the first capitalists because they organized a gang to appropriate the product of other people's labor.
Regularizing your plunder through tithes, tolls, and taxes. And thus it continued until roughly the end of the 17th century.
What's your evidence that it stopped then, though?
And the birth of modern liberal capitalism.
Okay, that is a cursed image if I've ever seen one, but okay. So you're saying that the idea of using violence to plunder workers ended with capitalism? I'm gonna have to say, I feel like maybe a citation is needed.
Sure, there were premonitions before then, little tremors of freedom, but almost everyone on the planet still lived in servitude and penury. Every previous society was based on systematized oppression.
Well, including capitalism.
Ruling elites would use the institutions of the state to loot its resources and then rig the rules so that their children would inherit the same privileged position.
Like, he's just describing all the things that capitalism has in common with previous, like... Yeah, I mean, like, every single bit of this is stuff capitalism has in common with other systems. Yeah, like, where's the argument, where's the values-based argument, unless you just mean the value of, unless you're talking shareholder value, which I would imagine, given who funds this, is probably the value that they actually care about.
A Bronze Age slave empire was not so different in this sense from a medieval European monarchy,
or a capitalist system.
Or a 20th century African kleptocracy.
Oh, isn't that interesting? They're using Mobutu. That hat there, that face without a face on it, that's Mobutu, which is kind of an interesting choice because that's who the CIA installed in what was then Zaire because they didn't want Lumumba. So, interesting choice of 20th century African klepto... Like, so the idea... I love how they decide the one thing that they're going to bring Africa in on is kleptocracy. And they're going to use the image of a guy who only ended up in charge of Zaire because the CIA overthrew Lumumba and put him in.
Or, come to that, from those modern states that have avoided the liberal capitalist revolution. Oppression, serfdom, and bondage were the lot of almost every human being from the moment civilization began until an eye blink ago. We don't know how lucky we are to live at a time and in a place where the rules are above the rules.
See, you have to have an English guy do this because the idea for the kind of rubes that they're going for is that an English guy in sort of actually a really shitty suit. I'm really not sure who chose this fucking suit for this guy. I am offended by this suit. Makes it look more clever.
The rulers. The great Victorian jurist Sir Henry Maine summarized the move to modern liberty in 3 words: status to contract. In nearly every previous society, our relations with one another were dictated by status, that is, birth and caste.
Yeah, well, yes, like sort of like some people are born in the status of workers and have to work for a living because they don't have inherited wealth and they can't live off of the proceeds of investments that they can't make because they don't have the capital to do it. And other people are born into money and can profit off of wealth. Yeah, I know. He chooses specifically, like, Africa. You could mention Africa in this context in a lot of different ways. And the way he mentions it is kleptocracies. And then he uses a CIA puppet, the image of a CIA puppet, to, like, yeah, I mean, this suit, I'm trying to remember, like, I have a specific, like, association with this kind of suit, and I can't explain what it is.
In a liberal capitalist society, we're free to make one-off freestanding arrangements with each other without needing to ask anyone else's permission.
Well, I mean, as long as as long as the money is there.
Our agreements, our contracts, are enforced by an independent court system, and adult citizens are equal in the eyes of the law.
Even when they are not equal in any other sense, because, again, capitalism exists.
That's it. That's the magic formula. Status to contract. Granted, and the rest follows. It's the difference between North Korea and South Korea.
Wait, actually, that's not a real difference between North Korea and South Korea. Their economic systems, there are definite differences in their economic systems, but the existence of employment contracts would not be one of the differences. The content of those contracts would be.
Between China and Taiwan, between Russia and Finland, between...
Wait, what, you don't think they have employment contracts in Finland?
Haiti and Bermuda.
Wait, like, what the fuck are even these examples? Okay, Russia is a capitalist society. It doesn't pretend to be anything else. Haiti is a capitalist society. In fact, I mean, the US has repeatedly invaded it and overthrown the only, like, democratically elected president they've ever had, twice, just to ensure that nothing changed about that. Like, how exactly is Haiti a distinction from Bermuda in this regard?
In a society defined by status, you get rich by sucking up to the people in charge. Emperors, or people's commissars, or presidents for life.
Yeah, you mean, so, like the way that people make a bunch of money by setting up propaganda channels on YouTube to suck up to billionaires and get the money from them.
But in a society defined by contract, you get rich by offering a product or a service to the people around you. As the 20th century economist Joseph Schumpeter put it, the capitalist achievement does not typically consist in providing more silk stockings for queens, but in bringing them within the reach of factory girls.
Except not really, because they are within the reach of factory girls. It's factory girls making the things, within his example here. They're very much within reach because they have to be within reach for them to make them. It's just that after they're done making them, they can't afford them. Hey, Riveroon.
I'll buy something on Amazon.
He's a guy who claims that English-speaking people invented freedom. He has a book about that.
Yes, I'm enriching Jeff Bezos. I'm adding fractionally to his net wealth. But
well, you're doing the bidding of the Koch brothers, actually, more than anything, though. You are on the channel that they basically practically own.
He is also enriching me, letting me buy pretty much whatever I want without having to get out of my chair. No other economic system rests.
I wonder if there's anyone else involved in that transaction that he's not mentioning. Like, is it just... Are we just dealing directly with Jeff Bezos? Does he just sort of magic the products to us when we buy them, chat? Or are there other people involved in that who maybe aren't getting as good a deal on that?
On voluntary exchange. Every other system requires coercion. And that is the moral case for capitalism.
So the idea is you just sort of like lie. That's the moral case. The moral case of capitalism is when you pretend that there's no coercion in capitalism. So lying then.
Not just that it makes us richer, though it does.
Well, it makes you richer apparently, although not rich enough to hire a fucking fashion consultant.
Not just that it raises the poorest on the planet, making our life outcomes more equal, though it...
Well, notice that even in his fucking example here, that not every people are still in poverty. Like, he can't even pretend. I mean, it would be silly for him to pretend, though a lot of though not any more silly than any of the other things that he's doing on this thing, that it took everybody out of poverty, because that clearly isn't the case. But, I mean, this isn't a very, like, what is this graphic even? Is this line supposed to be the poverty line? In which case, you've got 3 people who are below the poverty line, and 3 people standing just on it. And there's, like, I guess money is the sun?
No. The moral argument for capitalism is that it's the only economic system that values dignity and freedom and, yes, equality.
Yeah, I mean, you can tell that. I mean, if there's one thing that, I mean, it just, nothing says equality quite like the fact that you've got kids with school lunch debt and other kids who are sifting through garbage to come up with shit to sell in order to pay off other kids' school lunch debt. I mean, that's dignity, freedom, and equality. It's the trifecta right there.
It disdains distinctions of race and creed. One customer's money is as good as the next's. As Voltaire put it in 1764, enter the London Stock Exchange and you will see representatives from all nations gathered together for the good of mankind.
Well, yes, but, well, for the good of mankind? No, not... well, the particular representatives from all nations that happen to be in the London Stock Exchange would assume that they were indeed all of mankind and everybody else just didn't rate.
Here, Jew, Muslim, and Christian deal with each other as if all were of the same faith, and the only people called infidels are those who go bankrupt.
See, if I were making this video, I think I would have cut that quote off at the word faith. Because the minute you take the idea that people are going broke in the system, and they're being called infidels, which is wild, then you're not making a great argument for capitalism at that point. Then it sounds like capitalism is kind of cringe, actually.
Under capitalism, we need to think of what other people want, of what we can do for them. It's how we get ahead. Whereas socialism replaces our natural human relations with state control.
No, like, first of all, I love how the state, he's sort of pretending the state isn't in capitalism, apart from the independent courts. And, I mean, he even leaves out the cops, without which the independent courts mean nothing.
Capitalism draws us into productive networks of mutual dependency. We become more attentive, more empathetic, and thus more aware.
Yeah, if there's one thing, like, this is... Yeah, I mean, you can't even exactly say he's making a case for anything, because he doesn't provide evidence. That's the thing, it's like, they, like, manage to perform the, dance of making an argument. But without actually, making an argument.
Of the case for universal human rights.
Yeah, because capitalism is so great with human rights. I mean, just ask the people in Gaza. I mean, their human rights, clearly, it's so universal, because even in, like, people in Gaza, they got all the same human rights as we do, except that theirs nobody gives a shit about.
Capitalism doesn't just make us better off, it makes us better people. I'm Daniel Hannan, author of Inventing Freedom, How the English-Speaking Peoples Made the Modern World, for Prager University.
Yeah. Well, I think Voltaire's point was that religion had nothing to do with it. That in fact, what did that Voltaire? The reason that you would want, if you're trying to make the moral case for capitalism, to omit that last bit of the Voltaire quote is precisely because it says that their only way of valuing people is by how much money they have, and that's not something you'd want to bring up when you're making the moral case for capitalism. But that's the moral case of shit for capitalism. Okay, so we've got some David Pac-Man. Yeah, the people in the Congo, the people in Gaza, the people in the West Bank, people, there are lots of places you could go and ask whether this makes any sense. Actually, Haiti's a great place to ask whether they feel that capitalism is making everything better for them. The miners in Chile, actually, it's worth noting, are one of the best off sections of the working class there. Because the miners in Chile, because like if they even threaten a strike, the world copper market takes a shit. Let alone like the local share market, the commodities market in Chile takes a shit off of that. They are actually like economically some of the best off workers in the country because their strikes matter. They usually tend to get what they want. Okay, so there's some various Caleb Muppet things we could look at. There's some Vush. We've got David Pac-Man talking about how Joe Biden has 0 scandals if you don't count the genocide. We've got some other PragerU bullshit. So, what's everyone think, chat? We could look at Caleb's like amazing nose. We could continue with Caleb's amazing nose cam here, like this nostril vision thing he's got going on versus the libertarian dude in the Philippines. That is definitely an option. Fuck it, let's do a little bit more of that. It's only really just getting started.
Don't disagree. Yeah. I mean, one thing I do disagree. Go ahead.
Sorry, no, that was my son was.
Oh, okay.
Sorry, continue, please.
Oh, well, one thing that I do.
You can see his ring light in his eyes, and it is very disturbing.
Do disagree with a lot of libertarians on is they'll say that the Federal Reserve is a national bank. It's not.
Wait, that's like literally the thing that libertarians will say it's not. Because what libertarians like to do is pretend that there was some sort of like national monetary system before the Federal Reserve, and then suddenly it all went private, and then they get into a lot of really just low-key or high-key anti-Semitic shit. But the reality is, it is a hell of a lot less privatized than what came before it.
It's a private bank that the government, sets up. It's like a state monopoly, but it's a for-profit institution that's ripping off the American taxpayers.
Wait, a for-profit state monopoly? That sounds kind of like what Caleb's been advocating in this.
Every dollar that gets printed, we go like $2 into debt. It's one of the biggest rip-off schemes we've ever seen. And it's private bankers that are making private profits and using the government to facilitate it.
Well, yeah, I mean, that's just capitalism in general, though.
So I don't. I've seen many like libertarian leaflets and things that say it's the fifth plank of the Communist Manifesto or something, and I would say nothing can be further from the truth. A national bank is kind of like what Alexander Hamilton proposed.
Yeah, well, the Marx.
Oh, well, I mean, he's... Oh, wait, they're gonna get into Marx. Let's see who's more ignorant about Marx. We're gonna have a Marx ignothon.
Did call for the nationalization of credit in the Communist Manifesto.
Right.
That was,
and I agree with that. But that's not
right?
what the Federal Reserve is. The Federal Reserve is a private bank. It's private. It's just facilitated by the state. It's a state-facilitated private monopoly. Kind of like the MTA here in New York City. You know, the subways are awful in New York City, and a lot of people say that's because of the government, but it's actually a private company.
Yeah, that is a very good question, Adria. I wonder that myself. Because it's like he spends a lot of time in front of a camera. And I actually have a window open so I can check to see what the camera angle is doing for me or whether I need to adjust it. And I'm sure this guy, he thinks very highly of himself. He watches his videos. And he doesn't say to himself, wow, that I really gave people a noseful there.
It's the MTA, which is a public beneficent corporation. It's like a state for-profit private company that the government facilitates. And this is a thing.
Fun fact, the CPI Mark I is a private for-profit company registered under the laws of New York.
That, Milton Friedman and his ideas, he brought in a lot of this, right? That by privatizing government services, I mean, you can't have like two private prisons competing with each other. That's not going to work. But you can't.
Yeah, I mean, it does work. They compete for government contracts.
You can't have a private prison. You just have to hire one private prison, and then the government pays money to this private corporation. It's similar to charter schools, a lot of this. And a lot of these are...
But again, that's not an example of the absence of private competition. It is an example of the presence of it, but on a different level.
The kind of reforms that the rise of libertarianism has brought in, where it leads to the kind of crony capitalism that libertarians are against. But, if you take things that are done generally by the state and you have them done by private corporations, one private corporation is going to get the contract, and that leads to a sloppy situation. And that's kind of the reality of Friedmanite economics. I know that's not what some of the more hardcore libertarians want, but that's what Milton Friedman and his policies have largely led to is more crony.
See, this is one of the things about having when we watch two jabronis fight. One of them inevitably ends up having at least some halfway reasonable things to say, at least by comparison to the other one. And what he's saying here is not wrong. What he's saying here is absolutely not wrong. The exact thing that right libertarians, say they don't want is precisely what every single one of their proposals is guaranteed to lead to. I mean, he isn't wrong there.
Capitalism, not less.
Yeah, there's definitely a huge problem in the modern economic system, which it's tough to even describe what it is. Is it capitalism? Is it interventionism? It's a mixed economy. There's some elements of social control, some elements of private control. And what you have, and this is a criticism that the left brings up, which I think is very solid, is that you have the socialization of losses and the privatization of profits. You have these...
well, I mean, that's just capitalism in general, though. I mean, that's how capitalism works. In fact, there's even a term for it in in MBA's use. It's called externalization. The whole point is that all the risk and the loss involved in a particular transaction, you externalize it. You dump that off on people who aren't involved in the transaction and who, therefore, you don't have to give a shit about. Fucking Caleb's eyeballs are hypnotizing me now. It is absolutely creepy the way he's looking at the camera. Does he really not notice? I mean, it's like he's in a fishbowl or something.
Private cooperation deals, and at the end of the day, the taxpayer, the Joe Public, is left holding the bag.
I agree. Yeah. Yeah, and that, but you can tell if it's capitalism or socialism by why do the major centers of the economy function? Do they function?
Well, no, you can tell whether it's capitalism or socialism by who controls the major centers of the economy.
In order to make profits for private owners, or are they forced to cooperate according to a central plan that's good for society? That's the difference. You can have, a heavily government-controlled capitalism like they have in Saudi Arabia, or you can have a very market-oriented socialism like they have in Vietnam or Nicaragua. It's not a question of government ownership. It's a question.
No, well, yeah, except it is a question of ownership. It is a question specifically of whether it is owned by somebody other than the working class, or whether it is owned by the working class, and not in some like nominal, formal, legal way, where you have like there's a piece of paper that says this belongs to the public, but the public doesn't have any meaningful say in how it's used. But obviously, we're not going to.
Question of why does the economy function, and is profit in command, or do you have an economy that is working in the interests of society and the public overall, with a popular government controlling the economy to make sure that growth is, unrestrained? I mean, the successes of.
But why is it good for growth to be unrestrained? One of the things about Caleb Muppet is he doesn't know what growth is. And because he doesn't know what growth is, he doesn't know what degrowth is. And so he just talks about these things like they're an unalloyed good. And of course, in capitalist economics, growth is considered an unalloyed good. Because you need constant expansion. Capitalism requires constant expansion. But, I mean, that doesn't mean it actually is good. That just means capitalists think it's useful.
Socialism that we've seen in, like, Nicaragua, for example, have been their micro-entrepreneurship program. Has been their ability to help, the private sector get going, kind of with government oversight. So, yeah, that's kind of how I see things. I'm a 21st century socialist.
Which is just a fucking meaningless term. Like, I mean, first of all, like, the only bit that's true about that is he is in the 21st century.
Yeah, it's interesting where the distinction between socialism begins and capitalism ends. For example, and you probably know a lot more about this than I do.
I wouldn't bet on it.
In Yugoslavia, they had their own sort of system, and it was increasingly market-oriented, although still, I would say, communist. And Lumen von Mises remarked, or was asked, like, at what point does that become a capitalist economy? He said, when they have a stock market.
Well, I mean...
Yeah, which is why you don't ask Ludwig von Mises anything, because the answers are never going to be very worthwhile.
Most of the socialist countries in the world today do have stock markets.
Yeah, exactly. That's kind of, I mean... That is one of the other reasons they're not socialist.
Vietnam has a stock market. China has a stock market. But the difference is that when China's stock market crashed in 2015, it dropped 60 points in a day, and nothing happened. The society was largely insulated from it. And a week later, the government called up all the firms and it outlawed short selling. And then on top of that,
Yeah, so, I mean, it is just long-term. It's capitalism that thinks long-term. That is the real difference between a system like the US and a system like China on the economic level. Like, the reason that, like, China and Vietnam and various other countries actually did a much better job, at least initially, with the ongoing pandemic is precisely that they were in a position to be able, to think in the long term, whereas the long term for capitalists here is next quarter. And so the fact that you had, that the only way that this was going to get under control was to have a massive, like, social investment in things like fucking masks, N95s for everybody, and pay people to stay home from work until such time as ventilation and air purification can be upgraded everywhere, and in some cases, perhaps even after that, depending on just, how crowded it was going to be or something like that. That's not something, that meant, going without, taking operating on a loss for an entire quarter maybe. And, capitalists here wouldn't have it, whereas the state capitalist systems of like Vietnam or China were willing to eat that. Taking a more long-term view. It is not a fundamental difference that we're looking at there. It is a difference in approach, and that is why what he's saying is bullshit as well.
Basically froze the selling of shares by state-owned industries, and within a week, because the Communist Party said so, the stock market was right back up where it used to be. So they have a stock market in China, but that stock market is not subject to the turbulence, the regular market turbulence that you have with the stock market. And on top of that, most of society...
The U.S. share market for some time was also not subject to quite so much turbulence, because you had things like the Glass-Steagall Act, which was specifically designed after the Great Depression to stabilize some of that shit in the long term in order to avoid crises like that, and then it was dismantled. And of course, Caleb would say, his version of fake communism is that he would say you bring back Glass-Steagall, which would not be the worst thing in the world by any means. But of course the question is, why exactly did that stuff get dismantled in the first place? Why did, say, the global financial crisis not prompt it to be put back in place? And what does that tell us about where we are in, the history of capitalism?
Is insulated from it. The bulk, the overwhelming majority of entities in Chinese society have nothing to do with the stock market.
So,
the overwhelming majority of people in the U.S. also have nothing to do with the stock market. 98% of shares are held by, less than 1% of the population, something like that. Overwhelmingly, most people's connection with the share market is extremely peripheral, and only in the sense that when it goes up, it is often bad news for a lot of people.
In the world today, would you say is closest to your political ideal? Yeah,
this should be none, because my ideal, and in the world that we are striving for, is a world with no scarcity, in which there is so much abundance and so much wealth that there's no need.
Communism is when lines go up.
For any coercion, there's no need for any government. People can just kind of do what they feel like doing, from each according to his own ability, to each according to his needs. That's the
it's interesting. This is the first time I've ever actually heard him get to that part. Because usually he just stops around the time where he's talking about social democracy with one party or something. But this idea that there is a certain point when there is so much stuff being produced that nobody would have an interest in controlling access to it is just wild. It is just that always
ideal
gets
world.
me.
What we see around the world today are countries that have been kept poor by imperialism, by the domination of the kind of crony capitalism of the West, the big banks, the corporations. They've been kept poor, and they've been kept underdeveloped. They haven't built their own industries. And so in order to break free from the domination of the world globalist financial system...
Yeah, he's not good at any of the things. It is actually amazing that this man has a cult. Because he is a charisma vacuum. He's like Obama. He just drones on and on. All he does is drones.
They've had a revolution, and they've set up kind of a government that then takes control of their economy. And with that economy, they start building socialism. They start lifting themselves up. And China is a great example of that. Vietnam is a great example of that. The Soviet Union was a great example of that. I think they needed to adjust to more market policies. They weren't able.
It's just really amazing. He just his whole thing ends up being, could we have more capitalism in it? It is he takes all the 5 pages of revolutionary literature he's ever read, and he runs it through some sort of fucking de-revolutionizer. to take out like all of every single bit of like emancipatory revolutionary content from it and just turn it into just this piss weak social democratic crap. Yeah, he loves to hear himself talk, which I don't understand, because he is very hard to listen to, actually. He is not great at the talking. But yeah, he definitely doesn't understand a lot of what he's saying.
Able to do so, and so they, after years of difficulties and successes and victories, they ultimately collapsed. But
which, yeah, I mean, and that would be one indication of how maybe that isn't the way to communism. See, to me, when you look at things methodologically, I play chess. That's one of the things that I like to do. I'm not great at it. I have a lot of sort of theoretical knowledge of it that I'm not very good at implementing. And in chess, there's something called theory. And that is set sequences of moves that are known, like, to a mathematical certainty to provide a certain advantage for one side or the other. And when you have a response to one of these theoretical lines that negates that advantage, you say that line has been refuted. And the only thing to do about it, if you're going to play that line, is find some way to modify it. Well, I mean, here's the thing. We've had a lot of experience with, like, trying to take the capitalist state on a wild ride to communism, and literally never has it gotten there. In fact, I mean, the most successful examples are where it started way closer to communism than it ever was subsequently. And, every single time it ends up collapsing, and it just sort of reverts to regular-ass capitalism eventually. Now, from a strategic, practical standpoint, I would say that suggests that that particular line has been comprehensively, I talk about comprehensible input all afternoon on Fridays and Saturdays, so comprehensible is what my mouth defaults to. Comprehensively refuted and needs to be fundamentally reconsidered, unless, of course, you're just looking to get state power and you don't particularly care what comes after that. No, it isn't Stalin. It's Abraham Lincoln.
there's Cuba, Venezuela. There's many socialist countries in the world. Libya, under the leadership of Gaddafi, they had the highest life expectancy on the African continent. There's many countries around the world that have broken out of the domination of the Western financial system and then built themselves up with essentially.
Like, this gets me. It's like somehow he set this up so his name is covering up his mouth.
Planned economy,
I guess is a favor for anyone watching this who's hard of hearing and would be relying on lip reading, because they don't have to see what he's saying.
They all still have a long way to go. I mean, none of them are at the level that the West is at, because they're making up for lost time. They've been kept underdeveloped for so long, and then almost immediately as they have the revolution, then the West attacks them and wages war against.
He's like, okay, you can see the ring light pouring into his green screen behind it every time his head sort of bobs, which it does quite a lot.
Them and tries to lock them out of the economy with sanctions, etc. So, none of these countries are my ideal. And that socialism, it's not like a blueprint. It's not like we sit here and we dream up the perfect society. It's based on real social forces. It's based on what
like which social forces, Caleb? Which social forces are benefited by creating space to have a capitalist class?
Exists and how you can change it. You don't get a blank piece of paper on the day after the revolution and just write whatever you want on it, right? Cuba had a revolution, but it was still a deeply poor country. Well, what could they do? Well, they built a healthcare system, they eradicated homelessness, they electrified the country, but they're still a very poor country. They have a long way to go. But compared to the other countries in the region that are still dominated by Western capitalism, they're doing pretty well.
Although the thing is that because of the way the blockade works, it essentially, in order to be able to get any capital into the country, any funds into the country, they've had to, again, set up a local capitalist class because it's the only way they're able to interact with, like, the world capitalist economy, which is, again, why also the idea of just doing this in one country is not something that can last very long, because it is actually, they are very much moving into this sort of, like, regressive direction.
That's kind of what we're seeing today. And eventually, socialism, this system where you have a rationally organized economy, will, dominate all over the whole world. And eventually that system will give rise to so much wealth and abundance that we can have a world
That, watch the boat behind him.
without any coercion and total freedom. So that's kind of how I see things. Does that help at all?
Yeah, absolutely. Some socialists, like Richard Wolff, I would say a lot of socialists these days,
Like, people who have a much better claim to the title than fucking Caleb Muppet.
advocate for direct worker ownership of the means of production. Maybe you do as well.
Yeah, because so they're advocating for socialism. That's kind of wild.
What is your thought on? I'm not.
Oh, it's okay. Wait a second. This motherfucker is actually getting clowned on and exposed as a fake Marxist by a libertarian. This he's shaking his head like, well, no, you can't have the workers owning this shit. What are you gonna do if the proletariat starts taking things over?
That's okay. Go ahead.
You're done. I don't want to put any words in your mouth. What is your thought on that model of socialism
I.e., just like socialism, i.e., just the thing.
as a means to transition to communism?
Well, I'm not against it, but it's not socialism, right?
Wait, it's like he's gonna say it's literally not socialism if the working class controls production?
Because the essence of capitalism is production for profit. And if those profits are shared by all the employees...
That's not what he's talking about, though. That's not what he's, like, responding to. Because the idea of the working class controlling production is that it is no longer done for profit. It is no longer done to make commodities. Because the working class controls it, there's nobody skimming off the top. Now I'm beginning to understand something, though. Is this why he thinks everybody who talks about the working class controlling production, he thinks that just means worker co-ops within capitalism?
It's still capitalism, right? And you'd still, you'd want machines to eliminate jobs, because then if there's fewer workers, you get a bigger share.
Yeah, well, yeah, except if the working class controls production, why would that be a bad thing to eliminate those jobs? That would just mean less work for everybody.
A worker cooperative might pollute the environment to make more profits for itself.
Well, yeah, again, the point is the working class controls production and it is no longer done for profit. It isn't. The working class controls production and then everything stays exactly alike.
Worker cooperative, imagine that the military corporations were all worker cooperatives. Then the workers would want to have more wars so they could make more war profits.
Well, no. I mean, like, the whole reason that there's this idea of actually replacing national state standing armies with, like, people's militias is precisely that you don't have, that those people aren't, either doing war or preparing for war the whole time. They've got something else to do, and they only need to come out to do the military stuff, either, to just make sure that their, like, training's up to date or something like that, or if some shit goes down. That's kind of the idea. Like, the military corporation, what the hell is he talking about?
The problem is production for profit. In a socialist society, worker cooperatives are very successful. Huawei Technologies, that's the biggest telecommunications manufacturer in the world.
That boat is getting on my nerves. It keeps on appearing and disappearing. Like, this is the most annoying background he could choose.
Huawei Technologies is a cooperative under Chinese law, and Harvard Business Review actually called it the greatest example of profit sharing working. It's a huge corporation.
Yeah, well, so wait a second. You're literally using China, which you as a counter example to what you're talking about, because if it has profit sharing, if it's operating for a profit, then all the things you just said apply. It is just an example of worker ownership within capitalism, which ain't the same thing. And it isn't what, like, I mean, I haven't spent a whole lot of time listening to Richard Wolff, but my impression of him is that it's not what he's talking about.
And they're a cooperative, right? And there are many cooperatives in Nicaragua. There are many cooperatives in Venezuela and in Vietnam and in other socialist countries. So I'm not against it, but that's not the essence of what socialism is. And that's where I would disagree with Richard Wolff.
See, this is exactly an example of how this sort of de-revolutionizer he puts this stuff through. Because the revolutionary thing about, like, socialism, about overcoming capitalism, the whole idea is that you get rid of these assholes who are skimming off the top and whose like need to make large amounts of money without actually doing anything determine what gets produced and under what conditions and all that shit. You get rid of them and the working class simply takes over. In fact, the bit there's one bit of the manifesto he loves to quote, and he glosses over one bit, which is where Marx very specifically says that when he talks about the state, he means the working class organized as the ruling class. So literally not what he's talking about here.
You know, Richard Wolff's a friend of mine. I like a lot, and I've learned a lot from him. But
that is not the nicest thing he could have said about Richard Wolff.
He focuses on this workplace democracy stuff, and he's missing
he focuses on this socialism stuff where, like, you get rid of the capitalists.
Picture, which is production organized for profit.
He's a great communicator, and I think that a lot of what he
does he really think that Richard Wolff would disagree with the idea that you're trying to get the profit motive out of the system?
This is on is
again, chat. I'm not too I've watched a little bit of Richard Wolff. I've seen interviews every once in a while. Haven't really focused too much on him. But am I wrong here? Does Richard Wolff specifically advocate maintaining the profit motive?
Sort of pure theory. He's just trying to get the message to the public, in a way that's relatable. And I don't want to say dumbed down, but maybe dumbed down.
Yeah. I used to be in the office with him when we had a studio in New York City. He was an RT commentator. I'm an RT reporter, and so we hung out many afternoons and talked.
I did not know that about Richard Wolff.
He's been doing things a long time. I really like Richard Wolff. He's a really good guy. Really good guy. And one thing I really like.
I would be very interested to have this put to Richard Wolff and see if he agrees with this description of what he's talking about. Because if it is true that he's saying, like, that he wants to maintain the profit motive but have worker co-ops, well, that's bullshit. That's not socialism either. Like, that's just two ways to not do socialism. You've got the version where you have the state stepping in the role of the private capitalist and keeping everything else the same, in particular, denying the working class control over their workplaces. Or you have the formal workplace democracy in a capitalist system. I mean, if this is an accurate description of what Richard Wolff is advocating, then I mean it's just they're arguing about two different ways to not do socialism.
That he defends, even though it's not his understanding of socialism, he's into the worker cooperative thing. He will defend China. He will defend the Soviet Union. I really appreciate that. I think that's a good thing that he does. He does say that the idea that those societies were just complete failures, that's malarkey, and I think that's a really good thing for him to say. So I like that about him a lot. And he recommended I read the book Theories of Surplus Value, which is
have you?
Very, very, it's like the third volume of Capital by Marx, and I really enjoyed that. So I've learned a lot from.
Wait, okay, this motherfucker. There's no way he read the third volume of Capital. Like, if he read it, he managed not to understand a single word of it.
Richard Wolff. I don't discount his work, but his emphasis on workplace democracy, that's a little bit different than I see things. That's more from like
yeah, that's true.
the syndicalist, tradition. I'm from the Marxist-Leninist wing of things. So yeah.
Well, except he's not really even that.
You,
Let's be
you mentioned
honest.
earlier in your.
I mean, yeah, he started out there. I mean, definitely he started out there. But that's not where he is now. I think a lot of Marxist-Leninists would disagree. Like, I know a fair number of them. And one thing that we do agree on is fuck Caleb Maupin.
Ideal society, it's a
There's a
society
lot we disagree on, but
coercion. And that really resonated with me. That's my ideal society, is a voluntary society where all interactions, all economic relationships are voluntary, consensual, non-coerced. And I think that is the goal to work towards it. And what we have to do is work to eliminate coercion that exists in the world today.
I mean, okay, I do have to say, I actually don't have any notes there. I have a feeling that if he got into specifics, we would find some serious problems with his idea of how that works. But I mean, actually, that is better than 99% of the stuff that I've heard from right libertarians.
The other thing I wanted to say was, you mentioned imperialism, and again, this is one area where, aside from communists, basically nobody's done anything on it. Communists have put forth a whole theory on imperialism. I disagree with it. I have an alternate explanation.
Okay, now I'm kind of curious. What's his alternate explanation?
But it's such an important phenomenon and one that needs to be studied, and nobody is even studying it. So
lots of people are studying imperialism. I think you'll find. And by no means all of them people who would define themselves as communists of any kind.
It's absolutely,
Oh, he has a cat. Okay, that's one nice thing.
Absolutely extremely important to analyze.
Oh no, that's his kid. That's his kid's head sort of sticking out there. I thought he had a black cat.
And to understand, why do these empires go to war? Because it's not really for their own benefit.
Well, I mean, it depends on what you mean by their own benefit. If you mean for the benefit of their ruling class, I think you will find that 99% of the time, the reason a war is able to get started in the first place is that there were a few rich fucks in at least one of the parties to the conflict who decided it would be a way to improve their situation.
Look at the Iraq War or the Afghanistan War. Where's the benefit to America?
Well, I mean, there's a benefit to the capitalists in the U.S. There's a huge benefit. They made a ton of money. The arms industry made money hand over fist. The oil prices went through the roof. I mean, the fact is, they never really went down after that. I mean, not back to their original levels. I mean, actually, during that brief period where the U.S. pretended to be doing something about the pandemic, it did kind of get down to, like, the same nominal levels as I remembered it before Bush invaded Iraq. But, I mean, there's a ton of money being made there, and that's kind of the whole point. Yeah, it sucks for most people. It especially sucks for, like, the people in the country that is being targeted for the aggression. But there's tons of money to be made doing it.
For spending trillions of dollars, you're occupying these countries. You're making 1 billion people mad at you. Where's the benefit?
I'll tell you where the benefit is. Now, a country, Iraq, that used to export a huge amount of oil, has been blown to bits, and every ounce of oil that people used to buy from Iraq, they now have to buy from ExxonMobil, BP, Shell, and Chevron. Yeah, you have to imagine this is like a business. There's a guy who sells tires on one side of the street, and there's a guy who sells tires on the other side of the street. So,
well, I mean,
The one guy goes to the other side of the
See,
street.
again, this is the thing about when jabronis fight, because they have both actually made. It's like somehow the full of shittedness on both sides somehow cancels out, and they end up making relatively. I mean, at least occasionally, some valid points. Like, this is. I mean, I don't really have a whole. I don't have a. There isn't a huge disagreement there. I don't think you can limit it to the oil industry. I mean, they certainly did well, because the thing is, what people often, I mean, you get this with people who want to try to make the lobby the deciding force on why the U.S. Underwrites, underwrites Zionism. They'll be like, yeah, but all this conflict keeps oil production down, and yeah, that's what these companies want. They want an excuse to keep oil production down, to keep it in the ground, because that makes oil scarce, and if they have an excuse to make oil scarce, they can drive up the prices.
He burns the business down.
Hey, I don't
that's
know
basically
nothing.
what
How you
happened,
doing?
right? Iraq was an independent country that was a competitor with big oil, and now it's been leveled, and now everyone has to buy from the tire store that's still open. That's what imperialism is. It's about dominating the markets and getting rid of competition. That's why they hate Huawei technologies in China. That's why they hate Russia, because Putin fixed their economy by selling oil and gas on the international markets.
Yeah, I mean, and again, he is not really wrong here. Like, nobody, if the U.S. does not give a fuck about internal democracy in Russia. Like, I mean, it was not particularly democratic during all of the time. I mean, it was utterly undemocratic during all of the time that they were actually quite happy with how Russia was being run. The difference is, I mean, essentially, the thing about Putin is that he got in specifically because he was coming in on this platform of cleaning up the massive mess of corruption and shit that, the years of Yeltsin and everybody, in particular, and had created. So essentially, I mean, the U.S. created Putin. I'm not saying deliberately, although the U.S. did actually support him. And it turns out, I mean, MI6 seems to have supported him very directly during his first election campaign. Which means that, I mean, MI6 would not be doing that if the US had any objection to it, because that's just not how Britain works. But, like, the reason the US gives a shit about, like, Huawei or Russia or any of them is because they're competition. The reason the US doesn't like the idea of, I mean, multipolarity. I mean, people act like that's something inherently to be celebrated when it's really just a phenomenon of imperial decline. And it was going to happen one way or another. The US was never going to just always remain the only power that counted for all of eternity. That's something that is a historically specific thing, and it eventually ends. But the thing is, what the US doesn't like about that is that it creates spaces for non-alignment. It creates spaces for the smaller segments of the world, the smaller countries, the countries that are actually not really in a position to compete directly internationally with the US, to punch a little bit above their own weight, because they can play the US and Russia and China off against each other. Just like they did back when it was sort of a bipolar type system, where it was the US versus the Soviet Union, and you had countries like Malaysia did a lot of this. They did a lot of sort of playing the US and the Soviet Union off against each other in order to get the best possible deal from both of them. In fact, I mean, before 2014, that was essentially what Ukraine was doing. They were trying to play Russia and the EU off against each other to get the best possible deal from both of them, except the EU was not having it.
They just don't want competition. It's about dominating the market and clearing the market and destroying and beating down any competitor.
Jamaican ginger beer. I've never had Jamaican ginger beer. Well, how does that differ from other ginger beer? Now I'm curious.
Yeah, and that's such a tremendous cost to human life. I mean, between the
Yeah.
sanctions, both Gulf wars, I mean, Saddam Hussein was a bad guy. Don't get me wrong. What he did with the Kurds,
Well,
horrible.
I mean, which he did at the U.S.'s behest twice.
But but I mean, we're talking about millions of people that died either in the conflict or as a result of malnourishment, or they blew up the hospitals,
That
and then
fucking boat is driving me out of my mind. Why did he pick this background? Everything about this man is irritating.
you died from an infection because there was no. I mean, Iraq used to be one of the more developed countries
I
in the.
mean, and again, I mean, see, this is why. Mm, well, I'm gonna have to keep my eyes open for that. I don't know nothing. I like a good ginger beer. Like, I mean, what he's saying here. What was that again? Let me just. Yeah.
Because there was
Oh,
no.
that's right. He was saying Iraq was one of the more developed societies in the region, and that is actually very true. Um, they actually it was like for a long time, especially like in the 80s, like people in the upper classes in the rest of the Arab world would send their kids to Iraqi universities and their parents to Iraqi hospitals because they were the best in the region. They were had one of the absolute highest living standards around. Before the U.S. decided to just sanction them into oblivion.
So I mean, Iraq used to be one of the more developed countries in the Middle
Right.
East, and and
Right. I mean, they
and when
didn't blow up Iraq
Americans,
because of the bad things Saddam did. They blew up Iraq because of the good things he did, because he built Iraq with socialism. He took that oil and he
Well,
made
no,
it,
I mean he
the
did it with
Iraqi
state
state.
capitalism. I mean, the thing is, what he's describing as socialism. I mean, he's literally just doing the Bernie Sanders thing. Because what countries like Iraq, did their form of development. I mean, this is also Egypt under Nasser to a certain extent, and a lot of other places. Is literally what all the major Western economic powers did in order to become economic powers, which is to say, protecting their domestic industry, subsidizing the hell out of it, keeping cheaper, better imports at bay until they can compete. That is literally what Britain did. That is what the US did. It's what Germany and France did. It's what all of the major economic powers did. The Soviet Union and like China did the same sort of thing. You know, they kept the competition out of the country until they were in a position to actually compete with it. And a lot of what is called like globalization, you don't hear that term very much anymore because it's kind of done. It isn't a new thing anymore. It's just sort of the way shit works. With like the World Trade Organization and that. The whole point of it was to foreclose the like capitalist developmental model that the US and Germany and Britain all used in order to get to the position of economic preeminence that they're in.
National oil company, and he used that oil money to build
Oh, have a good
schools and
night.
build
I don't know nothing.
hospitals and electrify the place. And they couldn't have that. And he also sent money to the Palestinians to fight against Israel. And they couldn't have it, and so they blew Iraq to bits.
Hello, Joshua Daim. Am I pronouncing that correctly? Is that Daim? Is that Arabic or is that Daim? I like to get people's names right. Our world is surrounded by a much larger profit that profits from the societies they have cultured. We live in a garden, their garden, a prison. I'm not quite sure what you mean by that last part.
First, they played Iraq and Iran against each other. Those are two, revolutionary governments. One's a Shia Muslim government. One was an Ba'athist Arab socialist government. They played them against each other, and the USA was funding both sides in that war, and at least 1 million people died.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, not really sure where you're going with this. Oh, Yeah, I mean, I have to say this. I'm kind of thinking of switching over because there's not enough of the bullshit. Like the jabronis cancel each other all out. So I'm thinking I'm going to check out something a little bit different for the remainder of this stream. Gonna move over to, this is a new one for the stream. It's David Pacman, some liberal swill. He's gonna explain how Biden has zero scandals.
Let's talk today. Not about Joe Biden's accomplishments, but about the lack of scandal.
No, this motherfucker's hair annoys me.
One of the reasons...
Now, just in case you're wondering, this is from 2 weeks ago. So, like, when he's saying the lack of scandal, this is going on during the genocide, the one that has, like, the entire world and large numbers of people in the U.S. protesting against it. It's the reason that Biden has been having to, like, his campaign events have to kind of keep their schedules secret because protesters show up to every single one. This is okay, so let's hear about it.
That it is increasingly a focus of the right wing to talk about Joe Biden's age and supposed crimes for...
Yeah, I mean, it's not just the right wing talking about that.
Which they can never find any evidence.
Yeah, because the crimes that he's actually doing are crimes they support. That's the entire grift.
Is because of the total and complete absence of actual scandals from Joe Biden's presidency so far. There's an article or a commentary in which Furman University politics professor Danielle Vinson has talked about this and said,
like, so you're saying the genocide isn't, like...
that the focus on Joe Biden's age is because there have been no real scandals in his administration.
Yeah, I mean, he's not done anything that anyone objects to.
We're going to have likely a rematch in 2024 of the 2020 election.
Yeah, which is, I mean, it's wild because Biden was the only one Trump had a real chance against then, and that's still the case now. And the Democrats would rather lose the election than offer somebody who even smells like change.
Since that election, Joe Biden has had a completely scandal-free presidency, and Trump has been charged in 4 criminal trials with 91 felony counts.
Like, this is wild. Like, I mean, I want to take this and just, like, intercut it, you know, do a montage of him talking like this, do it as a voiceover of what Gaza looks like now. And we'll, I mean, because that is, like, how this will be. They'll, like, put this, there'll be, like, a documentary of, you know, anatomy of a genocide or something like that, 20 years' time. And you'll have, like, a segment on, like, the cultural component of the genocide and how you had, like, propagandists who were pretending it wasn't happening.
Has been found civilly liable of rape and defamation, fraud in New York, hundreds of millions of dollars in fines. And so in that environment, which is obviously a disaster for Donald Trump, they have to fabricate something, and what they're fabricating is, oh, Biden crimes, and Biden is...
But, I mean, Biden crimes a lot. I mean, ask the people in Gaza. I think they will tell you. Biden has not been holding back on the criming.
Is old. Now,
I mean, he is, and that is why we've ended up with this, like, utterly unedifying spectacle where 2 white supremacist rapists are going to square off and fight over whose dementia is the worst. Like, motherfuckers nobody asked for this fucking rematch.
Want to think through this issue of scandal, because we have a situation right now where there isn't the tumult and the drama and the genuine scandal of past administrations. And we'll
Really? Like, I mean, I really want to just mix this shit up with, like, footage of Gaza and Biden saying all the just absolute bullshit he's been saying about it. Because this is wild. Like,
we'll look at Obama, we will look at Trump. And so what you end up with in the absence of scandal is a sense of stability and a sense of narratives that in an ideal world comport more closely to the facts. And what we have
what
today
facts? Are we going to get to talk about the facts?
with Joe Biden's lack of scandal is a situation where the right is grasping at straws.
I mean, see, in his alternative timeline, Joe Biden isn't part of the right. This would be newsflash for Joe Biden, who, like, campaigned openly on how right-wing he was for the entire, like, geological age he spent in Congress.
Generating and constructing and fabricating rather than simply reporting what is. For example, the charge that Biden is involved in crimes that involve him as a sort of mob leader figure.
See, this is where I would cut in some, like, some protest footage where people are saying, Joe Biden, you can't hide, we charge you with genocide.
There's money from China.
And then somebody asking, and then that footage of the interview where somebody says, what do you think the chances of you allowing a ceasefire are? And he says, no chance.
And influence peddling and criminal bribery. None of it, after years of investigation, has led to any substantiated proof.
Yeah, I mean, and the thing is, that's the sort of shit that is just normal. I mean, focusing on that is always a zero-sum game for the political class. I mean, this is why it's actually wild that they've decided to go with that against Trump, because it is just so easy to find that kind of dodgy shit. Like, it is not even illegal for, members of Congress to do insider trading. They just kind of openly admit it. And they get offended when you suggest they shouldn't be allowed to do it like anyone else is. But, so, I mean, this is why this notion of scandal is, I mean, really quite interesting. I mean, Chomsky in his books about Iran-Contra and about Watergate as well and Vietnam actually talks about this whole thing about how it's interesting to look at what the scandal is and what the scandal isn't. Like in the case of Iran-Contra, the scandal was not, for example, the fact that he was sending that Reagan was sending death squads into Nicaragua in order to murder people at literacy centers and health centers and shit in order to get rid of the elected government, because everyone agreed that that was okay. The entire political class was cool with that. What the scandal was that he did this without asking Congress's permission.
And it's a really poignant example of the total lack of scandal that exists in reality and what they have to fabricate. The smaller the
the reason they have to fabricate it is because they literally, there is scandalous shit going on, but they're, like, literally personally involved in it, and their voters are actually kind of cool with it. So they have to come up with some other bullshit.
Real scandal. The more hard to believe and absurd the trumped-up fake scandals become. So the Republican Party is not focusing on policy disagreements.
But wait, you said that what they were focusing on was that he's old, and that's not trumped up or hard to believe. He is. Yeah, actuarial tables would say that both of these motherfuckers could easily just cark it before the campaign's over.
With Joe Biden, they're not even really focusing on ideological differences other than...
Yeah, because there aren't any, which is also actually kind of scandalous, because where there are ideological differences? There are some serious ideological differences between the majority of the general public and the political class.
Then every once in a while hurling socialist as an insult at Joe Biden.
Which is just wild. I mean, that is one of those insults that actually, it's like right wing, you know, like Republicans manage to make Democrats look better than they actually are. Like, they did that with fucking Obama, too, where it was like, oh, he's a communist, and I always had fun with that one, because occasionally, at the time, you know, I would run into people saying this, like, motherfucker, I'm a communist, I hate him. Like, seriously, if you were a communist, I would be supporting him.
They are trying to tarnish
never knew
the
what to do with that.
reputation of the administration, either through guilt by association when it comes to Hunter Biden, or just simply unfounded accusations, stuff that they are making up. Yes, it undermines the political discourse, but it also
like, is he going to do examples?
diverts attention from the policy accomplishments of Joe Biden, which I've explained many times. It's all they have. It's not a great strategy, but it's all they have. We then get to stories that they tell about the economy. Not only is there an absence of scandal under Joe Biden.
I mean, that's only because it is not considered a scandal that, say, according to recent figures that I saw, about half the population is struggling to make rent. And that's just cool. You know, it's something like a fifth of the workforce is just absolutely struggling to cover the cost of living and, you know, working part-time when they need full-time hours and all that sort of shit, and they're barely above the ridiculously inadequate poverty line. I mean, but that's not a scandal. That's considered prosperity.
We have an economy that, by all reasonable assessments, is pretty good.
Yeah, because the assessments that indicate that it's not very good, i.e. the assessments that look at how the working class is doing, for example, those aren't reasonable assessments. They aren't the sort of assessments that a guy like David Pacman would use.
Donald Trump predicted in 2020 that if Joe Biden becomes president, we would see a recession, 1929-style stock market crash, horrible stuff. What happened is the opposite. Unemployment rates are consistently and persistently low.
Well, it depends on which unemployment figures you look at, though. Because it is very easy to not have a job, want a job, and still not be counted in the official headline unemployment figures.
The stock market is hitting record highs almost every week.
Which is not actually a good thing.
Many sectors have completely rebounded from their pandemic-induced downturns. It is true that although inflation is down, prices are still much higher than they were years ago.
Yes. In fact, what do you mean years ago? They're much higher than they were 2 years ago, motherfucker. Like, my grocery bill doubled in the past 3 years. Okay? That had not happened previously in my lifetime.
Because inflation is still positive, right? When inflation comes down, prices are still going up, just not by as much.
Yeah, which sucks, actually, if you already couldn't afford to maintain any kind of reasonable standard of living. The fact that the inflation has stopped going up so fast, you know, that it is decelerated, that doesn't help much.
Supply chain disruptions are still affecting a number of industries, and it has generated hurdles. Biden's doing what he can to deal with it.
I mean, there's also, like, the scandal around the fact that Biden and Trump have, in lockstep with each other, decided on a policy of forcibly exposing the population to a lethal and permanently debilitating airborne pathogen, despite the fact that we know exactly how to stop the spread of it. We know that it works because other countries have managed it, and the result is that, like, millions of people are now permanently disabled. Like, I mean, I'd call that a scandal, personally. But, I mean, I'm not David Pacman. I don't get to decide these things. Okay, his fucking jumper is now annoying me.
That, and he's being proactive.
I mean, it looks like he's
reactive, but
it looks like he should have like a fucking bear head mask on or something like that. Like he's going to go out. Yeah, like this is a fursuit, but he's missing the mask.
because that is the status of the economy, they have to go to fabricating fake scandals. Now, critics could say that
Critics could say he's doing genocide and he's ruining people's health with this pandemic.
when you highlight the absence of a scandal, you are cheerleading for Joe Biden.
Well, yes, you are, and the fact that this is all you can manage for cheerleading already says part of the problem. Because what your argument here, you're trying to like make the case that he's great because of the absence of of anything that you consider a scandal. So like genocide doesn't rate, like the complete deliberate mishandling of the pandemic doesn't rate, the fact that poverty's through the roof if you actually look at it realistically based on the actual cost of living, that doesn't rate. So you're arguing that if you just sort of say all the shittiest things that he did don't constitute scandals, then he is a scandal-free president, and that's like the best you can do? That's not great. That is really shitty cheerleading. That's like, I mean, that...
Merely cheerleading for Joe Biden. What I'm doing is acknowledging facts that are about promoting reality and truth over hyperbole and conjecture.
Okay, but what... So, whether something is a scandal is a matter of fact? It's just, there's something that is objectively a scandal, and... So, I mean, because that doesn't seem right. That seems actually fairly subjective. What constitutes a scandal kind of depends on your perspective, I would think.
And there were a number of scandals under prior presidents, including Democratic presidents, and they can be seen alongside accomplishments and policy failures. What it happens to be, the reality of what it happens to be under Biden, is no scandals and a bunch of pretty good accomplishments.
Like, what is, how is that the reality? That's not, first of all, like, is he going to, we actually have to wrap up now, and there's still 9 minutes in this thing to go, and I'm like going to sleep on this myself. But is he going to say why he thinks certain things that are actually deeply fucked up that Biden is demonstrably doing are not scandals? Or is he just going to keep on repeating no scandals? Like, he's not defining the term so far at all. But it's too late now to really get into that. It is almost 1 a.m., so I would just like to thank everybody for joining in. It's always wonderful to see you, and I look forward to seeing you next week. Have a good rest of your weekend, have a good night, and good luck. And wow, David Pac-Man. God, that motherfucker's boring.